I'm ready to go.
This is a crisis.
This is no time for Donald Trump's record of hysterical xenophobia.
Biden's son inked a $1 billion deal with a subsidiary of the Bank of China.
Why are we getting nervous, man? China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. They're not bad folks.
Since the outbreak, the Communist Party has been mobilizing overseas organizations to buy local supplies and send them to China.
The growth of China is overwhelmingly in our interest. What a beautiful history we wrote together. Banning all travel will not stop it.
The president is right. That travel restriction on China, as every public health official we've talked to said, bought the country time.
Hysterical xenophobia. Xenophobia.
Joe.
I complimented him on dealing with China. I'm not going nuts.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
Trump campaign is now reaching voters online.
You are seeing the President of the United States. Look at the lines. You join our movement. A lot of President Trump supporters here. Greatest movement in the history of our country.
I think the one thing we can say they all have in common is they are fighters. Both figuratively and literally.
We are leaders in our community is going to ensure that President Trump gets reelected soundly in November.
Because we have such strong leadership coming from the White House, we are making it through.
God has called President Trump for this purpose in this time. So let's keep voting for him, and we will keep winning.
I honestly don't know why Joe Biden is running. He can't remember anything.
President Trump has been a champion for families and in particular for mothers.
And he ran on, I'm going to build the wall.
We are one people, one family, and one glorious nation under God. We will make America great again.
Welcome to Team Trump Online.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Team Trump Online's War Room Weekly, where we take a closer look at the excellent record of achievement from Donald Trump on behalf of the American people and contrast that with Joe Biden's dismal record of failure and terrible ideas for the future. I'm Tim Murtaugh with the Trump campaign, and we are fortunate today to be joined by U.S. Senator Ted Cruz from the great state of Texas. Senator, thank you very much for joining us.
Tim, it's great to be with you.
Today we're going to talk about China, Joe Biden's cozy relationship with China and his history of making excuses for them and not taking them seriously. So let's first start taking a look at China itself. What does China view its role in the world today, and how does it see its own future in the world?
Well, I think the Chinese Communist Party, their vision for the future is a vision of global domination. It is Chinese hegemony across the globe. And I believe the most significant foreign policy consequence that's going to come from the coronavirus pandemic, this crisis that we're in the middle of, is going to be a fundamental reevaluation of the United States' relationship with China. For a long time, I have been making the case that China is the single greatest threat to the United States for the next century, that their global ambitions are unlimited, that and their conduct and behavior with respect to this crisis, they played a direct role. They have direct responsibility for the 300,000 lives that have been lost worldwide when they actively covered up and hid the coronavirus pandemic, the outbreak when it began in Wuhan, China. Their responsibility, I think, here is clear, and I think reassessing, dealing with, combating the growing Chinese threat is the principal foreign policy objective for the President of the United States now, and it will be in the years to come.
Yeah, and I think, it's been said, I've heard others say that much the same way that the 20th century was the American century, the Chinese want the 21st century to be the Chinese century. And that's a message that quite obviously Joe Biden has not gotten, because he's got a long history of very clearly and almost smugly not taking China as a serious economic threat. And we've got some sound bites lined up here, and these stretch back more than 20 years. So let's take a look right now quickly to Joe Biden.
China is not our enemy. There is nothing inevitable about China and the United States not being as cooperative as any other two nations in the world.
China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. They're not bad folks, but guess what? They're not they're competition for us. We talk about China as our competitor. We should be helping and benefiting ourselves by doing that. But the idea that China's going to eat our lunch was like, I remember debates in the late 90s. Remember Japan was going to own us? Give me a break.
So that last clip was from January of just this year, and there's Joe Biden repeatedly and over the course of decades saying quite obviously that he does not take China as an economic threat still to this day. What is this? What is this? Is this ignorance? Is this just an astounding level of naivete on Joe Biden's part? Senator, how do you explain this?
Yes. Look, ironically, I'm going to both agree and disagree with Joe. Here's where I agree. I agree China's not going to win. The United States is going to prevail in this contest of nations. But that's not because China is not a formidable adversary. China's aspirations, you said it a couple of minutes ago that their aspirations were to dominate the 21st century. I think I'd modify that slightly and say their aspirations are to dominate the third millennium. In terms of the time frame that China is thinking, they're not thinking a matter of just a couple of years or even decades or even necessarily centuries. They are thinking in terms of millennia of what they believe is their destined Chinese dominance. Now, America will prevail in that battle because at the end of the day, freedom is stronger than tyranny. The principles that make America great work better than communism does. They're operating under a failed system, but we won't prevail in that battle, that fundamental battle of systems, if we're too naive, if we're too oblivious to even be aware that there's a battle being waged, much less to stand up and defeat the Chinese aggression. If you look at China, the Chinese Communist government, they have murdered over 60 million people. I got to say, one of the things that drives me crazy about Democrats is they have this nasty little habit of apologizing for communist dictators. They think they're cute. I remember when I was in college, there was one college kid down the hallway that had a poster of Che Guevara on his wall. And I remember going into his room and laughing and saying, hey, that's really awesome. Have you thought maybe of getting a Hitler to put next to it? Or maybe a Mao? I mean, if you're going to celebrate people who murdered, who tortured, who created gross acts of human suffering, Che was an amateur. I mean, if you really want Mao, you look at the systematic purges. And I suppose a Chinese apologist, otherwise known as a Democrat, would say, well, that was a long time ago. Okay, so fine. Mao murdered a lot of people a long time ago. Right now, today, as you and I are sitting here, the Chinese Communist government has 1 million people, Uyghurs, in concentration camps today. It is the active policy of the Chinese government to kill, to torture, to put people in concentration camps, to lie, and to suppress the truth. And we saw this with the coronavirus. The coronavirus, the first recorded observations of the coronavirus were in December of last year. And there were a handful of really courageous Chinese physicians, whistleblowers, who spoke up and said, I'm seeing a new form of a SARS-like virus that's being transmitted from human to human. This is really worrisome. This is really dangerous. And they began speaking up. And what did the Chinese Communist government do? They came down on them. They arrested them. They threw them in jail. They punished them. They made them sign a retraction that pointing out that a dangerous disease was amongst them what was contrary to social order. So they made them sign a retraction and they silenced them. Any responsible government, what it would do when an outbreak like this begins is you send in the public health professionals and you quarantine the people who are sick. And if they've done that, there's a very real possibility this coronavirus pandemic could have remained a regional outbreak instead of a global pandemic killing 300,000 people worldwide. And China, the communist government in China, has direct responsibility for those hundreds of thousands of deaths and for the trillions of dollars in economic devastation that has come as a result of it. And sadly, Joe Biden's worldview on China is, you used before the word naive. I think that captures it well. It's hopelessly naive. Gosh, the Chinese, what could be the problem? Well, they're malevolent communists who want to dominate us, who want to conquer us, and who are perfectly willing to let lots and lots of people die to lie, cheat, steal, and destroy. And that's part of their strategy. And I think that Joe is simply not equipped and doesn't even understand the threat exists.
No, and this is not a new phenomenon with Joe Biden either. I mean, it goes back decades, as we already talked about. He was a big champion of China's entry into the World Trade Organization. And in fact, on the Senate floor at the time, he said that China's economic impact on the world was equivalent to that of the Netherlands. So you want to talk about another data point exposing the naivete on Joe Biden's part. China equals the Netherlands economically. I mean, that's just astounding. China is now the second largest economy in the world. So how wrong was Joe Biden? Now, when it comes to trade issues, you're very strong on trade issues, and so is President Trump.
I'll point out if Joe Biden were to say that today, he might echo the line from A Fish Called Wanda and call the Netherlands the Nether Regions instead.
Yeah, classic. There's a classic reference you don't get all the time. A Fish Called Wanda. Excellent. But going back to the WTO and Joe Biden's just insistence that China needed to be included, here's President Trump's view on China's entry into the World Trade Organization and what it cost the United States. Here's the president.
The United States lost 60,000 factories after China entered the WTO. This is happening to other countries all over the globe. The World Trade Organization needs drastic change. The second largest economy in the world should not be permitted to declare itself a developing country in order to game the system at others' expense. For years, these abuses were tolerated, ignored, or even encouraged. Globalism exerted a religious pull over past leaders, causing them to ignore their own national interests. But as far as America is concerned, those days are over.
There you have the president again standing up to China. And we know that everyone who has campaigned for president has promised to get tough on China. But once in the Oval Office, no one ever did before President Trump came along. And it was very important because not only with respect to the WTO, China has a long history of cheating on trade issues, stealing technology, forcing the transfer of technology, manipulating currency. It runs the gamut. So, Senator, why is it important to have someone unlike Joe Biden, in the White House, who will stand up to China when it cheats?
Well, cheating and lying is not just an occasional behavior for China. It is a strategy, and it is indeed their central strategy. And if it's right that China is the single greatest geopolitical threat to the United States for the next century, and that China's malevolence is growing, that the danger from China is growing, then one of the most important criteria by which to assess this presidential election in November is who is best prepared to be commander-in-chief and to stand up to China. And I got to say, the contrast between Joe Biden and Donald Trump on that question is staggering. It's not even kind of a little bit close and little differences. It is night and day. Joe Biden has spent about 400 years in Washington, D.C.
But who's counting, right?
China. Well, you know, he was elected to the Senate when he was 12. But dismissing China over and over and over again, palling around with China, his family making money from China. Joe Biden standing up to China is a null set. It is not going to occur. He could not give the speech we just heard Donald Trump give. Joe Biden could not read those words and say them out loud. On the other hand, look, when Donald Trump ran in 2016 and was elected and beat Hillary Clinton, one of the front and center objectives was standing up to China and on trade. Donald Trump stood up to much of the world, and I can tell you the president was laser focused on pressing back on China, which I very much agreed with him, that pressing back on China on trade was very important because China took advantage of us. They kept us out of their markets while flooding our markets with their goods. And President Trump has led in that regard. But I'll tell you, you want to have the starkest contrast for who perceives a threat and has the backbone to stand up and the leadership to stand up and combat that threat. Go back to January. Go back to the beginning of this pandemic. China has been lying for a month about the coronavirus pandemic. Wuhan is getting worse and worse. The numbers are getting worse and worse. China's lying about it. China is telling the World Health Organization, which acted just really as a puppet, parroting the propaganda from the Chinese Communist government. They're saying that there's no human-to-human transmission. So January 14th, World Health Organization echoes that, says no human-to-human transmission of coronavirus. This is mid-January. The numbers keep going worse and worse. Meanwhile, at the same time they're doing this, China's doing several other things. They are, number one, allowing people to travel from Wuhan all over the world. So people are flying from Wuhan all over the world. They're flying to Italy. They're flying to Iran. They're flying all over the globe. China is also at the same time surreptitiously, secretly hoarding protective equipment, hoarding ventilators, hoarding masks, hoarding gloves. They begin, if you look at their purchases, they begin buying them in large quantities and they stop selling them abroad because they can see this pandemic coming and they don't want anyone else to see it. So they're stockpiling their own reserves while allowing people to fly all over the globe, potentially carrying the disease. Then January 31st, President Trump makes a very important decision, which is to shut down commercial air travel into and out of China. That was a decision I had urged the president to do. I spoke to him 2 days after he made that decision and encouraged him. Then he asked me, what do you think of, did we do the right thing? I said, absolutely yes. This is dangerous. The risk in terms of lives is massive. Now, what was the effect of halting air travel into and out of China? A couple of months ago, I chaired a hearing in the Senate on the coronavirus, and we had experts from the CDC, from the Department of Transportation, and Customs and Border Patrol. I asked all three of them at the hearing, what was the impact of President Trump's travel ban on China on January 31st? All three of the expert witnesses told the Senate, as a result of that travel ban, the number of cases in the United States was significantly reduced and the number of deaths in the United States was significantly reduced. That was a bold, courageous decision. All of the media criticized him. And as you know, Joe Biden jumped up and criticized the president as well for blocking travel from China, from Wuhan, right when this pandemic was beginning.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you bring that up because that decision that the president made to limit travel to and from China on January 31st was early in the process and decisive. And Joe Biden did, in fact, ridicule it, along with a lot of the, shall we say, intelligentsia in Washington and in other countries around the world. As you mentioned, and as we just confirmed, let's hear it from Joe Biden himself about those criticisms.
In moments like this is where the credibility of the president is most needed as he explains what we should and should not do. This is no time for Donald Trump's record of hysterical xenophobia, and fear-mongering.
So there is Joe Biden sounding on top of his game, as always, very, very sharp there in those remarks. But again, as we were just discussing, this is not someone who was taking it seriously. This is not someone who was willing to endorse effective measures that the president was taking. This is someone who is doing nothing but taking advantage of an opportunity for purely partisan gain. I mean, when Joe Biden is out there on the campaign trail these days saying that, oh, I was warning the whole world about this in January and February, he was still campaigning normally into the second week of March. So we know all of that is not true. So, you know, how can Joe Biden, do you think there's any reason for anyone to take Joe Biden seriously when he talks about this issue?
No, look, he's pretending he'll be tough now. But we know when the decision was made, the decision to halt travel into and out of China, that Joe Biden criticized it. He called it hysterical and xenophobic. Those were his words, blasting the travel ban. And by the way, Joe Biden wasn't an outlier in the Democratic Party. That's where Washington Democrats were. Nancy Pelosi, right after President Trump imposed the travel ban on China, introduced legislation in the House called the No Ban legislation to ban the travel ban. So that was the Democratic Party position. The New York Times ran not one, but multiple op-eds blasting the travel ban, saying it's unnecessary. The World Health Organization, the mouthpiece for Communist China, put out publicly a statement criticizing travel bans and saying travel bans are not helpful for dealing with these disease. And every bit of that was a pile of crap. It was just wrong. And it was because all of them didn't perceive the threat and were unwilling to take the steps necessary to stop it. Now, the New York Times subsequently had this big expose where they said, well, some people were still allowed to travel into and out of China. And it's true, the travel ban did allow American citizens to return. They were subject to quarantine. They were subject to testing, but it did allow American citizens to come back. And, you know, it's all fine and good if you want to criticize the administration and say the travel ban should have been even stricter. That's not a crazy position to take. But you don't get to take that position when you blasted it at the time as hysterical and xenophobic and you didn't want it at all. That's not an out for you to say, well, you stopped 90% of the traffic and I wish you'd stopped 100 when you were screaming, don't stop any traffic, because saying that there's a deadly disease that could come in and kill us, we're not willing to say, which is where Joe Biden was. And he got it wrong on that. He's gotten it wrong on China over and over and over again, because he doesn't perceive the threat. And, you know, Tim, last October, I did an Asia tour. I traveled to Pearl Harbor, to Japan, to Taiwan, to India, and Hong Kong. And it was designed to really be a friends and allies tour. So it was major allies of the United States, all surrounding China. And the central discussion in the whole trip was China. How do we combat China's growing military power, economic power, diplomatic power, the malevolence we're seeing? You know, it was striking when I was meeting with the leadership of the Pacific Command in Pearl Harbor, where we were talking about the Chinese military buildup we're seeing. And we're seeing the Chinese implementing fifth-generation weaponry, which they didn't develop. They've stolen that technology from us. So they don't have the R&D cost. Instead, they steal the technology and they're investing hundreds of billions of dollars in building up their military. And the level of intellectual property theft, look, we've always had intellectual property theft. There have always been thieves and corporate espionage and pirates. That's existed forever. From, you know, the first caveman that chipped a tire, somebody probably stole his design. That isn't new. What is new is a nation state with trillions of dollars of resources incorporating theft as an integral part of their strategy. So their strategy, they send spies into America, into our universities. I've spoken with university officials all over the country where they have Chinese nationals on their faculty being paid by the Communist Party of China, stealing their ideas and sending them back to China. It's a massive problem that our universities are woefully naive and ignorant about. Confucius centers. Confucius centers are Chinese language centers on universities that teach Chinese language, and they're paid for and controlled by the Chinese government. I introduced legislation, and the Senate Armed Services Committee got bipartisan support and passed it into law, prohibiting Department of Defense funds for any university that has a Confucius Center, because these are become the base for espionage and propaganda. The result of my legislation, more than a dozen of these Confucius Centers have shut down. The scope of this threat is massive. It is across the board. Big business is terrified of taking on China. The money that they spend buying support, buying friends. You know, when I was on the Asia trip in October was when the whole issue of the NBA came up. If you remember, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, my home team, Daryl Morey, he sent the most innocuous little tweet. He said, stand with Hong Kong, stand for liberty and democracy. Now, frankly, prior to that tweet, nobody had ever heard of Daryl Morey. Unless you're like me, unless you're a Houstonian and a hardcore Rockets fan, you didn't know who Daryl Morey was. Well, the Chinese Communist government flipped out. They lost their minds because he had sent this one tweet. And what followed was a series of groveling apologies from the NBA and also NBA stars. You had LeBron James coming and defending China. Oh, you know, Daryl Morey just didn't understand their human rights record. Well, which part of concentration camps and torture and murder do you want to defend? But look, the NBA wants hundreds of millions of dollars they get by access to the Chinese market. It is a huge problem, and China uses that economic might as a tool. And we need a serious, focused, coordinated strategy to stand up to China, to decouple our economy from China, not to have our supply chain dependent on China, not to have pharmaceuticals that we need for life-saving medicine manufactured in China. I think all of these discussions now have changed fundamentally coming through this pandemic, because suddenly the handful of us who were speaking out and saying, we've got to change what we're doing, suddenly a whole lot of other people are realizing that President Trump was right when he said we got to stand up to China. He was right, and that is our challenge going forward.
Yeah, and despite all of this, despite all the evidence, and you're talking about espionage, there are reports now that Chinese interests are trying to hack in to the computers to try to decipher what is going on with the work on a vaccine for the coronavirus. So they're trying to steal the research on the vaccine as well. And through all of this, Joe Biden remains soft on China, and there must be a lot of reasons for that, but we have a good idea of what one of them is. And that's the fact that when he was vice president, he went on a trip to China on Air Force Two, and he took his son, Hunter Biden, with him. And when Hunter came home, he got a $1.5 billion investment from a state-controlled National Bank of China. Now, the basic question there, of course, has to be, what did China want for that money? Why would they throw $1.5 billion at Hunter when his dad was the vice president? Let's take a listen to the president of the United States, and then we'll come back. Here's President Trump.
China gives his son $1.5 billion. How would you like to have Joe Biden take over negotiations right now with China? I don't think so. I don't think so. Meanwhile, Biden allowed China to rip off America for 8 years as vice president, and Barack Obama let him just rob us blind. And we're not doing that anymore. Those days are over. The Bidens got rich, and that is substantiated, while America got robbed. That's what happened. Sleepy Joe and his friends sold out America. They didn't have tough negotiations. I look at these trade deals and I say, who the hell could have done this? If you had no business instinct, no business ability, if you had nothing, if you're dumb as hell, you wouldn't make these deals. They're so bad. I say, who made these deals? Who made these deals? But we're ripping them all up and redoing them, and they're going to be very good. Wait till you see what happens. And now that I'm your president, you see it. America is winning again, and we're respected again as a nation.
Hunter Biden got $1.5 billion in investment from a state-controlled bank in China, while his father was the vice president of the United States. I realize this is kind of an easy one for you, Senator, but why is that important?
Well, you remember simpler times when corruption was just $10,000 in a paper bag handed secretly under a table in a smoky bar in Washington? Well, corruption sadly has gotten much more sophisticated in Washington. And with Joe Biden, there are just a lot of questions about his family enriching themselves in order to get policy decisions from Joe Biden. Just a couple of months ago, in fact, while the coronavirus pandemic was building, Washington was consumed with the impeachment trial because that was the Democrats' priorities, not protecting us from a pandemic that could endanger millions of lives, but a partisan attack on the president. And a lot of the impeachment trial focused on Hunter Biden and his conduct in Ukraine, where the Ukrainian natural gas company there, Burisma, was getting prosecuted by a prosecutor in Ukraine, and they wanted to get rid of that prosecutor. And so they hired Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and they paid him $1 million a year. Now, that's a lot of money for someone to be a director. I don't know about you, but I've never had a Ukrainian natural gas company call me up and say, hey, come serve on our board of directors. That's kind of out there, particularly given that Hunter Biden didn't speak Ukrainian. As far as I know, the only thing he knew about oil and gas is, I guess, once or twice he'd filled up his gas tank on his car. He wasn't a geologist. He wasn't an engineer. He had no background in anything having to do with natural gas in Ukraine. But he did have one attribute that was particularly important, which is Daddy was in the Naval Observatory and he was vice president. And lo and behold, Hunter gets $1 million a year. And Joe Biden picks up the phone and calls the president of Ukraine and threatens to put on hold United States aid unless they fire the prosecutor. And actually, Joe Biden is on video in another video saying in Joe Biden's words, and son of a bitch, they fired the guy. So not only was that corruption playing out in Ukraine, but this wasn't lost on the rest of the world. Imagine for a second, you're a totalitarian communist dictator. Imagine you have designs on global domination. Imagine you believe the next millennium should be the Chinese millennium. And you have a sitting vice president who basically has a for sale sign hanging outside, that it's clear that if you want to make friends with a vice president, shovel cash at his son Hunter. And look, Hunter, I don't know Hunter. By all appearances, he has led a very troubled life. But Joe is putting Hunter on Air Force Two, is flying him to China. If you're a corrupt Chinese communist dictator, you're saying, hey, wait a second. This guy, Hunter, really close to the vice president. He's his son. Boy, they're palling around on Air Force Two. And then Hunter comes back and says, you know, I'd really like $1.5 billion. Now, let me point out, that's one heck of an inflation from $1 million a year at Burisma to $1.5 billion. Wow, that's they've gotten sophisticated at this shakedown. And you're sitting there saying, well, I want to have influence with the vice president. Let's write a check. And to use Joe Biden's own words in a different context, son of a bitch, they gave him $1.5 billion. Now, all of those are facts. They're undisputed. The media won't cover them, but they're undisputed facts. Step back and ask, in what universe is Joe Biden going to be able to stand up with strength, with fortitude, and combat China? In what universe is Joe Biden going to be able to do anything were he elected president other than bow his head and continue being chummy with China, letting them eat our lunch, to use his phrase again. Now, look, China is not going to win, but it's not going to win by magic. The reason it's not going to win is because we're going to beat them, because we will be clear-eyed and strong and use American free enterprise to stand up to the commie bastards. And if Joe Biden's looking to get the next donation to his son's next business venture, I don't know where you go. He went from $1 million a year to $1.5 billion. You know, it's kind of like, to do another movie reference. You know, I don't know if Dr. Evil, the next contribution coming is $1 trillion. I don't know, but it ain't good.
Well, Senator, the world travels of Hunter Biden with his father, Joe Biden, and all the money that flows with it. This is something that we will be tracking and we'll be talking about as in the scope of Joe Biden's very cozy relationship with China over the decades. And Senator Cruz of Texas, Senator Ted Cruz, thank you very much for your time. That's all the time we've got here. I wish we could go another 30 minutes or so, but the clock beckons. So thank you for being with us here today. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim. God bless.
And we hope you join us again here on Team Trump Online's War Room Weekly, where we take a look at the president's excellent record versus the dismal record of Joe Biden. And before you go, let me remind you to download the official Trump 2020 app. It gives you the straight news from the campaign, lets you volunteer, make phone calls, and even earn points for great prizes that you can turn in and win things up to and including a picture of yourself with President Trump. Thank you very much for watching, and join us next time on War Room Weekly.
My name's Joe Biden. I'm a Democratic candidate for the United States Senate. Corn Pop was a bad dude. I'm a Democrat. I'm not going nuts.
You'd be the oldest president in American history.
Are you Winston Churchill? All right, Chuck. Thank you very much.
It's Chris, but anyway.
It would put 720 million back in the workforce. We choose truth over facts.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of what we call
Truth Over Facts.
Today, we're examining the curious case of Sleepy Joe and, you know, the thing. Our investigation begins at a recent campaign stop in Texas.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing. You know the thing.
The thing was Mr. Biden, who had access to our nation's top secrets during his disgraceful 8 years as vice president, trying to reveal state secrets. Some have suggested he was.
You know the thing.
Yeah, bro, I was the first to tweet that I know the truth about the thing. I've seen every national treasure over 87 times. He was snatching documents. As it relates to the thing, I know exactly what he meant. Second Declaration of Independence.
So we spent the last few days digging around in search of truth over facts. Thank you for sitting down with us. Let me ask, is there a second Declaration of Independence? So there you have it. Joe Biden, who often doesn't know what state he's in or that Margaret Thatcher is no longer the Prime Minister of Great Britain, has not, in fact, discovered a new Declaration of Independence. Join us next time when we will work with a renowned sketch artist who will reveal who or what is a lying, dog-faced pony soldier.
I guess I'm done, aren't I?